The words reached her before morning light touched the frost on the windows. "I married her out of duty. Nothing more." They had been spoken the previous evening behind the heavy oak door of the Duke's study, in a voice low enough to be private, but clear enough to be overheard. A footman had caught them first. By the time the candles were snuffed in the servants' hall, every soul in Thornhollow knew. Alowen, the Duchess of Ashenmere, learned of it the way a person learns of weather, not by looking out the window, but by watching others reach for their coats. She entered the breakfast room at 8:30, as she always did, and the silence that met her was louder than any accusation. A maid who had been setting the table dropped her gaze to the floor. The butler, a man named Hargrove who had never once offered her more than rigid courtesy, now offered her less, a fractional turn of the shoulder, a plate set down with exaggerated care, as though she might shatter at the sound. She understood immediately. Not the specific words, those would come later, delivered by a sympathetic kitchen girl who thought she was being kind, but the shape of them. Something had shifted in the household's careful architecture of deference, and she had been moved to its lowest floor. She sat in her usual chair. She buttered a single slice of toast with the same composure she had worn every morning for the 8 months since she had arrived at Thornhollow Hall as a bride. No one spoke to her. The chair at the head of the table was empty. The Duke was as absent as he always was, a name on a marriage certificate, a shadow passing in a corridor, a door closing at the end of a hallway. She had married a ghost, and now even the ghost had pronounced her worthless. But Alowen did not cry. She had stopped crying a long time ago, in a different life, over losses far greater than a husband's indifference. She finished her toast. She folded her napkin. And as she rose to leave, she felt it, the unmistakable weight of being watched. Not by the servants whose eyes slid away whenever she turned, but from above, from the gallery that overlooked the breakfast room, where a small figure stood in the shadows, gripping the iron railing with both hands. A child, silent, pale, and utterly still, watching her with an intensity that no 5-year-old should possess. The child was Lady Rosalind Blackwood, the Duke's only daughter, and she had not spoken a word in 2 years. She had been 3 when her mother, the first Duchess, had died. A fever that swept through the county had taken her in the space of a week, and something in the child had closed shut like a door slammed by a violent wind. The physicians called it elective mutism, a condition of shock. The nursemaid called it grief. Lady Morvane, the Duke's paternal aunt and the woman who governed every breath drawn within Thornhollow's walls, called it a phase that would pass with firmness and routine. It had not passed. Rosalind existed in the margins of the great house like a small, solemn apparition. She ate what was placed before her. She submitted to being dressed and bathed. She sat through lessons with her governess, Miss Arden, without absorbing or resisting them. She occupied space without inhabiting it. The Duke handled his daughter's condition the way he handled his own grief, by not handling it at all. He visited the nursery once each evening, stood in the doorway for precisely 3 minutes, and asked whether there had been any change. There never was. Alowen had first seen the child on the day she arrived at Thornhollow as a new bride. The household had assembled in a rigid line of unwelcome. Lady Morvane at the head, the staff behind her with carefully blank faces. And at the very end of the line, half hidden behind the skirts of her nursemaid, a small girl with dark hair and enormous gray eyes. Those eyes had fixed on Alowen with an unblinking gravity, and something in the child's gaze had pierced straight through the armor of composure that Alowen had spent months constructing. It was recognition, not of face or name, but of kind. One lonely creature identifying another. After that, the incidents began, small, almost imperceptible at first. Alowen would be walking through the long gallery, her footsteps echoing in the cathedral hush, and she would sense a presence behind her. She would turn to find Rosalind standing at the far end of the corridor, perfectly still, watching. The child never approached, she simply observed, with the patience of a wild animal deciding whether a stranger could be trusted. Then the distances began to close. Aloan would be reading in the morning room, and Rosalind would appear in the doorway, hovering on the threshold like a moth drawn to lamplight but afraid of the flame. She would stand there for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and then vanish as silently as she had come. The governess reported it to Lady Morvain with concern. The nursemaid reported it with bewilderment. Neither could explain why a child who showed no attachment to any living person was shadowing the new Duchess through the house like a small silent ghost trailing a larger one. The first touch happened in the conservatory. Aloan had gone there for air. The great glass structure adjoined the east wing, filled with the remnants of what had once been a magnificent collection of rare plants, now half-wild from neglect. She had been standing by a trellis of jasmine when she felt a small, cool hand slip into hers. She looked down. Rosalind stood beside her, her face tilted upward, her gray eyes searching Aloan's face with a desperate, wordless question. The child's fingers were trembling. Aloan did not gasp. She did not pull away. She did not kneel and coo and make the fuss that would have sent the child fleeing back into her shell. She simply closed her hand around those small, trembling fingers and held them gently, steadily. As if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, they stood like that for a long time, hand in hand among the jasmine, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. The language between them was older than words. When the governess finally found them, she let out a sharp cry of surprise that shattered the spell. Rosalind pulled her hand free and retreated behind her wall of silence. But the damage, if that was the word for it, was done. By evening, the entire household knew. The Duke's silent daughter had taken the hand of the woman he had married. Out of duty, and something unspoken had passed between them that no one could name and everyone feared. Lady Morvain's reaction was swift and surgical. A new schedule was drawn for the child. Rosalind's movements were to be confined to the nursery wing. Her time with the governess was extended, and a single pointed instruction was issued to the staff. The Duchess was not to be left alone with Lady Rosalind under any circumstances. The order carried no written explanation. It needed none. Everyone understood. Aloan received the news of her restriction with the same still expression she wore for all of Thornhollow's cruelties. She inclined her head when Lady Morvain informed her, murmured a quiet, "Of course," and returned to her room. She closed the door. She turned the key. And only then, in the privacy that was the sole luxury this house afforded her, did she press her back against the cold wood and allow herself to breathe. She was not angry about the child. She was terrified that the fragile, beautiful thing that had happened in the conservatory would cost her everything, not her comfort, not her standing. Those had never been hers to lose, but her purpose, the real reason she had walked through the doors of Thornhollow Hall months earlier and placed her hand in the cold grip of a stranger. Her name was Aloan Blackwood, now Duchess of Ashenmere, by law and ceremony. But the woman who stood trembling against that door was someone else entirely. Someone who had existed before the title, before the wedding, before the careful performance of meekness that she wore like a second skin. She was Aloan Renwick, the only daughter of Harland Renwick. Her father had been a botanist of uncommon gifts, spending his life cataloging the rarest medicinal plants of the British Isles, illustrating them in painstaking detail, and developing formulations that had drawn the attention of the Royal Society itself. His life's work, 14 years of research and 200 original illustrations, had been contained in a single leather-bound portfolio that he guarded more carefully than any treasure. He had also been a man of misplaced trust. When Harland fell ill 3 years ago, his brother Aldous had arrived at the family home in Devon with the efficiency of a predator who could smell weakness from 100 miles away. He brought a solicitor. He brought a revised will. He brought a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Harland died on a Tuesday in November. By Friday, Aldous had produced the new will. The property, the portfolio, the illustrations, everything was his. The original will, the one that left all of it to Elowen, had simply vanished. She fought. For months she fought, with letters and petitions. But Aldous had the documents, and the unshakable confidence of a man who understood that the law was an instrument built for people with means, and she had none. She was 21 years old, orphaned, penniless, and utterly alone. Then a letter arrived from a man named Pemberton, a retired professor and colleague of her father's. He remembered something Harland had mentioned, that during his 2 seasons at Thornhollow Hall as a guest of the old Duke, cataloging the estate's conservatoire collection, he had entrusted certain documents to the old Duke for safekeeping. The original deed, his true will, several of his most valuable illustrations. He had feared Aldous even then. The old Duke had agreed. The documents were hidden somewhere within Thornhollow. And then the old Duke had died, and his son Soren had inherited 1,000 responsibilities that left no room for the forgotten promises of a dead man to a dead friend. When Pemberton's letter reached Elowen in Whitby, where she had been working as a seamstress, it changed everything. It gave her a direction, a reason to endure. And then fate provided the means. The old Duke's deathbed promise to Harland had included a provision that the Renwick girl should be looked after. Soren had interpreted it in the most efficient way available to a man who viewed obligation as a thing to be discharged, not understood. He offered marriage, a title, a home, the protection of his name. It was not a proposal. It was a settlement. Elowen had accepted, not out of gratitude and not out of hope for love. She accepted because it placed her inside the walls that held her father's legacy. She had spent months searching, carefully, silently, a few stolen minutes at a time. The conservatory, the study, the unused rooms of the East Wing. She had found nothing. And now, because a lonely child had reached for her hand, her ability to move freely through the house was being stripped away by a woman whose contempt for her had been apparent from the first day. Lady Morvain. The name sat in Elowen's mind, like a stone in a shoe, a constant, grinding irritation. But it was worse than irritation. It was danger, because Elowen had discovered something in her quiet months of watching and listening. Something she had not expected and did not yet fully understand. Lady Morvain corresponded regularly with Aldous Renwick. The letters arrived on the first Tuesday of every month, addressed in a hand that Elowen would have recognized in her sleep, her uncle's hand. The hand that had signed her father's forged will. The woman who controlled her daily life was connected to the man who had destroyed it, and Elowen did not yet know why. Lady Morvain Blackwood had not always been cruel. There had been a time, decades ago, when she was merely Formidable, the old Duke's younger sister, installed at Thornhollow after an unhappy marriage, left her widowed at 30, with no children and no estate of her own. She had made herself indispensable. She had learned the rhythms of the great house the way a general learns terrain. And when the old Duke's wife died, she had stepped into the vacuum with an authority that no one, not even the old Duke himself, had thought to challenge. She controlled the household accounts, hired and dismissed staff, managed the social calendar, and the maintenance of the grounds. Thornhollow was not hers by title, but it was hers by occupation, and she defended her territory with the vigilance of a woman who understood that her position was borrowed. The arrival of a new duchess should have been the natural end of her reign. In any well-ordered household, the wife of the master assumed command of domestic affairs. But Elowen had arrived with no family, no fortune, no social standing, and no apparent desire to assert herself. She had been quiet, deferential, and seemingly grateful for whatever small courtesies were extended to her. Lady Morvain had assessed her in the first week and concluded that the girl was no threat, a mouse the Duke had dragged in from obligation, too timid to challenge the established order. That assessment had held for 7 comfortable months. Then the child had taken Elowen's hand, and the calculus had changed entirely. A duchess who was ignored by the household could be managed. A duchess who was loved by the heir could not. If Rosalind attached herself to Eloin, if the child began to speak again and credited the new duchess with her recovery, then Eloin's position in Thornhollow would become unassailable. She would no longer be the Duke's unwanted obligation. She would be the woman who saved his daughter. Lady Morvain could not allow that. But her hostility toward Eloin was not merely territorial. It was something older, something rooted in the monthly letters that arrived in pale blue envelopes, sealed with wax and addressed in a slanting, confident hand. The letters from Aldous Renwick. Their contents were never shared. They were read in private, behind a locked door, and the originals were burned in the grate of Lady Morvain's sitting room. Whatever passed between the Duke's aunt and Eloin's treacherous uncle was a secret kept in ash, and had bound them together in a complicity that stretched back further than Eloin's arrival, further perhaps than Harland Renwick's death itself. Eloin sensed it the way an animal senses a coming storm. She could not prove the connection. She could not name the conspiracy. But she felt its shape in the way Lady Morvain looked at her sometimes, not with the dismissive contempt of a woman guarding her authority, but with the sharp, assessing fear of a woman guarding a secret. And that fear told Eloin everything she needed to know. Whatever Lady Morvain was hiding, it was worth being afraid of. The new restrictions were enforced with a quiet, suffocating efficiency. Paul Lowen's days, which had previously been her own to fill with reading, walking the grounds, or sitting in the conservatory, were now subtly regimented. Lady Morvain did not issue orders directly. She arranged circumstances. The morning room was suddenly being redecorated. The east corridor connecting the family wing to the nursery was closed for repairs. The conservatory was locked for seasonal maintenance. Every path that might lead Eloin to the child was quietly, systematically sealed, and it worked. Days passed without a glimpse of Rosalind. Ben too. Eloin ate her meals alone, walked the gardens alone, sat in the library staring at pages she could not read. Where was the child? Had she retreated further into her silence, believing that yet another person had abandoned her? She told herself it was better this way. The child was a distraction from the work she had come here to do. She was running out of time. Aldous was consolidating his hold on the stolen property. But logic is a poor balm for loneliness, and Eloin's loneliness was a vast, hollow thing that filled every room she entered. It was on a Thursday, 11 days after the restriction was imposed, that the silence broke. Eloin was crossing the main hall on her way to the library when she heard it. The soft, unmistakable sound of bare feet on stone. She stopped. She turned. Rosalind stood at the top of the grand staircase. She was in her nightgown, though it was barely past noon. Her dark hair was uncombed. Her face was pale and drawn, and her gray eyes, those enormous searching eyes, were fixed on Eloin with an expression that no amount of firmness or routine could have produced. The child had escaped the nursery. She had come looking for Eloin. She stood on the top step, her small hands fisted at her sides, her whole body trembling with the effort of a courage she should not have needed at 5 years old. Eloin's heart cracked open. Every instinct screamed at her to climb those stairs, to gather the child in her arms, to hold her and whisper that she was not alone, that she would never be alone again. But even as the impulse surged through her, she heard the click of a door opening behind her, the measured tap of heeled shoes on flagstone, the faint, familiar scent of lavender and cold authority. Lady Morvain had entered the hall. The three of them formed a triangle of impossible geometry. The child at the top of the stairs, the woman who wanted to reach her at the bottom, and the woman who stood between them, watching with eyes like polished flint. Eloin did not move. She could not go to Rosalind. Not with Morvain there. Not with the unspoken threat hanging over every interaction, the threat that any attachment to the child would be weaponized, reported to the Duke as interference, used as grounds to have Eloin removed from Thornhollow entirely. She lowered her gaze. Lady Rosalind appears to have left the nursery, she said, her voice steady and colorless. Perhaps Miss Arden should be informed. The words were correct. They were proper. They were exactly what was expected of a woman who understood her place. And they cost Aloan more than anything she had ever said in her life. Rosalind stared at her from the top of the stairs. The child's lips parted. Her chin trembled. And then, a sound so small it was almost imagined, a whimper. Not a word, not a cry. Just a thin, broken note of bewilderment, the sound of a creature who had risked everything to reach the only warm thing in a cold world and had been turned away. Lady Morvain's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "I will see to it," she said, and moved past Aloan toward the staircase, her heels sharp against the stone. Aloan turned and walked toward the library with measured steps, her back straight. She reached the library, closed the door, and pressed her forehead against the cool wood. She had obeyed the rule. She had protected her position. She had preserved her mission. And she had broken a child's heart to do it. What she did not know, could not have known, was that she had not been the only one watching from below. A door at the far end of the hall, the door to the Duke's study, had been open a crack. And behind it, half in shadow, Soren Blackwood had seen everything. He had seen the child on the stairs. He had seen his aunt enter the hall. He had seen the Duchess, his wife, though the word still felt foreign in his mouth, face a choice that should never have been forced upon her. And he had seen her choose obedience over tenderness, duty over instinct, with a composure that he recognized because it was a mirror of his own. Soren closed the study door and stood in the darkness for a long time. He was not a man given to introspection. He had been raised to act, to decide, to govern. The Blackwood men were bred for administration, the way hounds were bred for the hunt. His father had managed Ashenmere's 12,000 acres with the same brisk efficiency he applied to choosing a necktie, and Soren had inherited the method, if not the ease. Since his father's death, since Arabella's death, since the silence that had swallowed his daughter whole, he had kept himself moving. Estate business, tenant disputes, drainage projects and harvest yields, and the endless numbing arithmetic of land and revenue. Work was his fortress. Inside it, he did not have to think about the daughter who would not speak to him, or the wife he had married out of a promise he barely understood, or the vast echoing absence that Arabella had left behind in every room of a house too large for the living who remained. But what he had just witnessed through that cracked door refused to be filed away with the drainage reports. The Duchess had been given an impossible choice, and she had made it with a dignity that unsettled him precisely because he could not dismiss it. He had expected, what? Tears, perhaps. A scene. The kind of emotional display that would confirm his aunt's assessment of the girl as unstable, attention-seeking, a disruption to the household's careful order. Instead, he had watched a woman swallow her own heart and walk away in silence. He had seen her face in the instant before she turned, a flash of anguish so raw and so quickly suppressed that it was like watching someone extinguish a flame with their bare hand. And he had heard Rosalind's whimper, that terrible tiny sound, and watched his aunt ascend the stairs with the satisfied precision of a woman who had won a skirmish she should never have been fighting. He sat down at his desk. The estate ledger was open before him, columns of figures waiting for his attention. He stared at them without seeing. Rosalind had gone to her. That fact alone was extraordinary. His daughter had not voluntarily approached another human being in 2 years. Not him, not the governess, not the parade of physicians and specialists he had brought to Thornhollow at considerable expense. She had existed behind a wall of silence so complete that he had begun in his darkest moments to wonder if the child he had known was gone forever. And yet she had left the nursery on her own. She had navigated the corridors of this vast house on her bare feet. She had found the Duchess and stood at the top of those stairs with her fists clenched and her body shaking. And she had tried to reach someone, not him. Not her father, who visited her nursery each evening for precisely 3 minutes of agonized, wordless ritual. She had chosen a woman she barely knew, a woman the household dismissed, a woman he himself had reduced to a phrase uttered in a moment of exhausted frustration. "I married her out of duty." Nothing more. The memory of those words now sat in his chest like a swallowed coal. He had spoken them to Morvain. His aunt had been pressing him about the Duchess's role in the household, and the subtext was clear. She wanted confirmation that Alowan was temporary, that the real authority remained where it had always been. And he had given her what she wanted. He had said the words because they were easy, because they allowed him to retreat back into his ledgers without examining the quiet presence that had been moving through his house for all these months, like a current of warm air through a cold room. But words once spoken do not care about intent. They go where they are carried, and these had reached the one person who had done nothing to deserve them. He thought of Alowan at breakfast. He had not been there, he rarely was, but he could imagine it. The averted gazes, the careful silence, the slow, corrosive humiliation of being publicly diminished in a house where she had no allies and no escape. She had never complained. In all her time here, she had never once come to him with a grievance, a demand, or even a request. She had occupied her rooms, walked the grounds, spent hours in the library, and conducted herself with a reserve so absolute that he had mistaken it for emptiness. Now he reconsidered. What if that reserve was not emptiness but restraint? What if the woman he had dismissed as a mouse was, in fact, something else entirely? Something held in check by circumstance, not by nature. He stood and walked to the window. The view overlooked the east garden, dormant hedgerows and bare flower beds, waiting for spring to reach this far north. He had watched her walk there sometimes, a solitary figure in dark wool, her pace unhurried, her head slightly bowed. He had never wondered what she was thinking. He had never wondered anything about her at all. That was the truth he could not avoid any longer. He had brought a woman into his home, given her his name, and then treated her as though she did not exist, not with malice, not with intention, but with something arguably worse, with complete and total indifference. And despite that indifference, she had done something he could not. She had reached his daughter. She had penetrated a silence that had defeated physicians and governesses and his own clumsy, anguished attempts at connection. She had done it not with strategy or expertise, but simply by being present, by being still, by offering a hand without demand. And his aunt had punished her for it. A memory surfaced. His father, in this very study, months before his death, he had paused over his papers and said something Soren had dismissed at the time. "I owe a debt, Soren, to a friend, a good man. I want you to see that his daughter is looked after. Promise me that." Soren had promised the way one promises a dying man, quickly, sincerely, and without asking enough questions. When the solicitor explained that the girl was destitute and that the most practical protection was marriage, Soren had agreed because it was the path of least resistance. He had not asked why the girl was destitute. He had not asked who her father was, beyond a name, Renwick. That meant nothing to him. Now, standing at the window, he felt the first cold stirring of doubt. About Morvain's eagerness to contain the girl. About his own willful blindness. He turned from the window and pulled the bell cord by the fireplace. When the butler appeared, Soren spoke without looking up from his desk. "Hargrove, who manages Lady Rosalind's daily schedule." "Lady Morvain oversees the nursery arrangements, Your Grace, and the recent changes, the restricted access, the locked conservatory. Those were my aunt's decisions." A pause. Hargrove's face betrayed nothing, but the hesitation itself was an answer. "I believe so, Your Grace." "On whose authority?" Another pause. Longer this time. Lady Morvain indicated that the arrangements had your approval, Your Grace. Soren's jaw tightened. "She was mistaken," he said quietly. "That will be all." Hargrove withdrew. Soren remained at his desk, his hands flat on the surface, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. His aunt had lied. She had used his name to enforce restrictions he had never sanctioned against a woman he had pledged to protect. The realization was not explosive. It was slow and grinding, like the sound of a foundation shifting beneath a house that had stood for centuries. He did not yet understand why. He did not yet see the full shape of what was happening beneath the surface of his ordered, grieving household. But for the first time since Alowan had arrived at Thornhollow, the Duke of Ashenmere was paying attention. And that, for Lady Morvain, was the most dangerous thing that could have happened. Lady Cressida Blackwood arrived at Thornhollow without warning on a wet afternoon in late March, stepping from a hired carriage with a battered leather trunk and the wind-swept authority of a woman who had spent the past 2 years refusing to set foot in the house that held her grief. She was 61 years old, with silver hair pinned loosely beneath a traveling hat and eyes that were the same dark amber as Soren's, though hers had not yet learned to hide. Lady Morvain received her with barely concealed alarm. The dowager's visits were rare, unscheduled, and invariably disruptive. She had no respect for routine, no patience for protocol, and a talent for saying the precise thing that no one wanted to hear. "Where is she?" were her first words after she removed her gloves. Morvain's expression tightened. "Where is whom?" "The girl. The wife. The one my son married while I was trying to forget I had a son. She found Alowan in the library." She found Alowan in the library, seated by the window with a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. She was looking out at the rain-soaked gardens with the expression of someone watching a country she could not enter. Lady Cressida studied her. The plain dark dress, the hands clasped in front, the face that was lovely in a quiet way, with gray-green eyes and a mouth that looked as though it had once known how to smile. "You are not what I expected," she said. "Your Grace, I did not know you were coming. That is precisely why I did not announce myself." She sat down opposite Alowan, uninvited. "I have not come to inspect you. I have come to see what my son has done. The Duke has been absent, negligent, hiding behind his ledgers like a man who believes that if he counts enough sheep, he will not have to think about the wolf at his door." Her voice was not unkind, but it had the unsoftened edge of a woman who had run out of patience. "Including you." "I have no complaints, Your Grace." "No, you would not. That is what concerns me." She leaned forward. "I received a letter from Hargrove. He has served this family for 30 years and has never written to me. He told me that a child escaped her nursery to find you, and that you were forced to turn her away while my sister-in-law watched, and that you endured all of it, without a word." Elowan's composure cracked, a hairline fissure, there and gone. "I am grateful for my position here. Your position. You are the Duchess of Ashenmere. Your position is at the head of this household, not cowering in a library while Morvain rearranges the furniture of your life." That evening she found her son in his study. "You told Morvain you married that girl out of duty. I was not aware that my private conversations were being broadcast. Everything in this house is broadcast. You handed them a blade and they used it on the one person who cannot defend herself. She is provided for. She has nothing." Cressida's voice cut like shears through silk. "She has a title she did not ask for, a husband who will not look at her, and a sister-in-law who treats her like an infestation. She was reaching a child that no one else could reach, and Morvain shut that down and you allowed it. I did not know about the restrictions until it was too late. Yes, that is the pattern, is it not? You did not know your father was dying until it was too late to say goodbye. You did not know Arabella's fever was fatal until it was too late to hold her hand. And now you do not know your own wife because you have decided in advance that she is not worth knowing." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I have spent one afternoon in this house, Soren, one afternoon, and I can tell you 3 things about that woman that you have not learned in 8 months." He said nothing. His face was stone. "She is educated, not merely literate, educated. The books she reads are not novels. They are botanical treatises. She was reading Linnaeus when I found her in the original Latin, and she had made annotations in the margins in pencil so faint she clearly intended to erase them. Cressida held up a hand as his expression shifted. She is brave, not the bravery of action, but the harder kind, the bravery of endurance. She has been treated abominably in this house, and she has not broken, not bent, not complained. That takes a spine of iron, and you have mistaken it for meekness. She paused, and she is hiding something. I do not know what, but her eyes have the look of a woman with a purpose, not a woman who has given up. She came to this house for a reason, Soren, and it was not for you. The last words landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. What are you suggesting? He asked, his voice low. I am suggesting that you open your eyes before Morvain closes every door in this house. I am suggesting that you speak to your wife, not at her, not past her, but to her. And I am suggesting that whatever debt your father owed to that girl's family, you have not yet begun to pay it. She left him standing in his study, his hands braced on the desk, the lamplight casting deep shadows across his face. She had done what she came to do. She had named the wound. Whether her son would tend to it or let it fester was now his choice. Lady Cressida's arrival changed the atmosphere of Thornhollow the way a match changes the atmosphere of a room full of gas, not with an immediate explosion, but with the sudden crackling awareness that everything was combustible. Morvain adjusted. She became more careful, more courteous, her cruelties receding beneath a surface of impeccable hospitality. She deferred to the dowager with an oily graciousness that fooled no one, least of all Cressida, who watched her sister-in-law the way a cat watches a mouse it has not yet decided to chase. Elowen, for her part, felt the shift, but could not afford to trust it. Cressida's warmth was genuine. She could feel that, but warmth alone would not find her father's documents, and time was running out. Aldous' letters to Morvain had increased in frequency. 2 had arrived in the past week alone, and each time, Morvain had retreated to her private sitting room with an urgency that bordered on panic. Something was happening. Something was accelerating. It was Cressida, unwittingly, who gave Elowen the clue she needed. They were walking in the East Garden on the second day of the dowager's visit. Cressida had linked her arm through Elowen's with a familiarity that startled the younger woman, and they strolled together past the bare rose beds and the skeletal espaliered fruit trees. The conversation had drifted, as conversations with Cressida often did, from the trivial to the significant, without any visible transition. My husband loved this garden, the dowager said, pausing to examine a budding branch. He was not a gardener himself, but he admired those who were. He had a friend, years ago, a botanist. A remarkable man. Spent 2 whole seasons here, cataloging every plant on the estate. My husband gave him a room to work in. A small study off the conservatory with a door that locked. He called it the cabinet. I believe it has been sealed since my husband's death. Elowen's heart stopped. She kept her face perfectly still. Years of practice, years of hiding, had taught her to receive a blow without flinching. But inside, her mind was a blaze of white light. The cabinet. A private study off the conservatory, sealed since the old Duke's death. That was where her father had worked. That was where he would have hidden the documents, not in the main library, not in the Duke's study, but in the room that had been given to him, the room with a door that locked, the room that no one had entered in years. What became of the botanist? Elowen asked, her voice steady, conversational. He died, I believe, some years ago. A shame. My husband spoke of him with great fondness. Cressida sighed. This house collects the dead the way other houses collect dust. They walked on. Elowen said nothing more about the cabinet. She filed the information away in the locked vault of her mind, alongside the burned letters and the monthly correspondence, and the growing certainty that everything she had endured in his house was about to either save her or destroy her. That night, she made her decision. She would find the cabinet, she would get inside, and she would do it tonight, while the household slept, and Cressida's presence kept Morvain's attention divided. The conservatory was locked, but Eloan had spent months memorizing the geography of Thornhollow's keys, every housekeeper's ring, every spare kept in the butler's pantry, every rusty duplicate hanging on hooks in the boot room. She knew that the conservatory's key, an old iron thing with a scrolled handle, hung on a nail behind the row of gardening cloaks near the east door. She had seen it weeks ago and noted it with the careful, silent precision of a woman who understood that survival was built from small observations. She waited until the house was dark, until the last candle in the servants' corridor had been extinguished, and the only sounds were the settling of old timbers and the distant, mournful call of an owl across the moor. She dressed in her darkest gown. She left her shoes beside the bed and went in stockinged feet, silent as a whisper on the cold stone floors. The east corridor was a tunnel of blackness. She did not carry a candle. The risk of being seen was too great. Instead, she navigated by touch, her fingertips trailing along the wall, counting doorways. Third door on the left, then a turning, then the narrow passage that led to the back of the house. The boot room smelled of leather and damp wool. She found the key by feel, her finger searching the nail behind the cloaks. Cold iron met her palm. She closed her hand around it and held it against her chest, willing her heartbeat to slow. The conservatory door yielded with a soft, protesting groan. She stepped inside and was immediately enveloped by warmth, the residual heat trapped beneath the glass roof, even at this hour. The air was thick with the scent of earth and green growth, the overgrown plants pressing close in the darkness like living walls. She moved through the tangle of neglected foliage, her hands brushing leaves and stems, following the glass wall to the far end. The cabinet, Cressida had said, a small study off the conservatory. There had to be a door. She found it behind a curtain of overgrown ivy. A narrow wooden door set into the stone wall where the conservatory met the main house. It was locked. Not with the same key. This lock was smaller, older. She knelt and examined it by touch. A simple ward lock, the kind used on interior doors a century ago. She reached into her hair and withdrew a pin, long, thin, bent at a precise angle. It was not the first lock she had picked in her life. Destitution taught many skills that gentility preferred to ignore. The pin found the ward. The mechanism turned with a soft, decisive click. The cabinet was small, barely 8 feet square, and utterly dark. She risked it now. She struck a match from the box she had tucked into her pocket and lit the stub of a candle she had taken from the kitchen store. The flame revealed a room frozen in time. A writing desk, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. A chair pushed back, as if someone had just stood up. Shelves on every wall, lined not with books but with specimens, dried botanical samples pressed between sheets of glass, each one labeled in a handwriting that struck Eloan like a physical blow. Her father's hand, she pressed her knuckles against her mouth to stop the sound that rose in her throat. His writing. His careful, elegant cursive, the letters she had watched him form at his desk 1,000 times as a child. Here, in this sealed room, preserved like insects in amber, she moved to the desk. The dust was undisturbed. No one had been in this room for years. She opened the drawers, one by one. Empty. Empty. The third drawer stuck. She pulled harder. It gave way with a crack that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, was a leather portfolio. Her hands shook so violently she could barely untie the knot. The oilcloth fell away. She opened the portfolio and spread its contents on the desk letters. A dozen of them, in her father's hand, addressed to the old Duke, and beneath them, folded into thirds and sealed with her father's personal stamp, a document on heavy legal paper. The deed to Rosewood, the family property in Devon. Oh, made out in her father's name with a codicil naming his sole heir, his daughter, Elowen Margaret Renwick, and beneath the deed another document, a letter from her father to the old Duke, dated 3 months before Harlan's death. She held the candle close and read, her tears falling silently onto the desk. "My dear friend," the letter began, "I write to you in confidence and in fear. My brother Aldous has been making inquiries about my estate, my work, and my will. I have reason to believe he intends to challenge my daughter's inheritance. I have therefore placed the original deed, my true will, and my most valuable illustrations in your keeping, in the room you so generously provided for my work. I trust no one else with this burden. If I should die before I can resolve this matter, I beg you, see that Elowen receives what is rightfully hers. She is all I have in this world, and she deserves better than the world has prepared for her." A floorboard creaked behind her. Elowen's blood turned to ice. She spun around, shielding the candle with her body, and saw a shape filling the narrow doorway of the cabinet. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark dressing gown. His face was half in shadow, half in the amber glow of her candle, and his dark eyes were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen before. Not anger, not suspicion, but a fierce, penetrating attention that pent her where she stood. Sorin, he did not speak immediately. His gaze moved from her face, to the desk, to the scattered papers, to the open portfolio. He took in the scene with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to assessing situations before reacting to them. "You found it," he said. His voice was quiet, almost neutral, but there was a tremor beneath the surface like a fault line under still ground. Elowen could not move. She could not think. Every carefully constructed story, every prepared excuse, every lie she had rehearsed for this moment, all of it evaporated in the heat of his gaze. "How long have you been watching me?" she whispered. "Long enough," he said. He stepped into the room. The small space shrank around them, the walls pressing close, the scent of dust and dried flowers thick in the air. He reached the desk and looked down at the papers. He picked up her father's letter and read it in the candlelight. His face changed as he read. The controlled mask shifted, tightened, cracked along lines she had not known existed. "Renwick," he said, the name landing in the silence like a bell. "Harlan Renwick was your father." It was not a question. Elowen's chin lifted. The pretense was over. The mask was off. She stood in the candlelight, in her stocking feet, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she was no longer the meek, invisible duchess who ate her toast in silence and walked the gardens alone. She was Elowen Renwick, Harlan's daughter. A woman who had endured 2 years of destitution and 8 months of quiet degradation to stand in this room at this moment. "Yes," she said. Her voice did not waver. He set the letter down. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she could see the machinery of his mind working, the pieces falling into place, the botanical treatises, the Latin annotations, the way she had moved through the conservatory with a familiarity that went beyond casual interest, the way she had known exactly where to look. "You came here for this," he said, "not for the marriage, not for the title. You came for these papers. Yes, you accepted a loveless marriage to a stranger so that you could search this house for your father's stolen legacy." Yes, he was silent for a long moment. The candle flame guttered between them, sending shadows leaping across the walls. "Why did you not simply tell me?" he asked. And for the first time, his voice held something that was not authority or composure. It held bewilderment, a raw, unguarded confusion that made him look, for an instant, like a man rather than a duke. Elowen met his eyes. "Because you married me out of duty, Your Grace. You told me so yourself, and if you did not say it to me directly, you said it loudly enough for every person in this house to hear. A woman who exists in your life as an obligation does not come to you with demands." She does not come to you at all." The words struck him. She saw it. A flinch, small but unmistakable, as if she had pressed a thumb into a bruise he had forgotten he carried. The silence stretched. The candle flame steadied. "You should not have heard that," he said, his voice rough. "And yet I did." He looked away from her, his jaw working. He picked up the deed and studied it, then set it down with a care that seemed almost reverent. He straightened and turned back to her, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The authority was still there, but it was no longer cold. It was the voice of a man making a decision. "Take the papers," he said. "Take them to your room. Lock them away. Speak of this to no one." He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes. A light, a resolve, a reckoning that was still taking shape. "I will deal with this. I will deal with all of it."
"Your Grace, you came into my house to find your father's truth,"
he said, cutting her off. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of stone. "You walked through my door and into a life you did not want, and you did it with more courage than I have shown in 2 years. I do not yet know the full shape of what has been done to you, but I know enough to know that it will be answered." He turned and left the room without looking back. Aloan stood in the candlelight, her father's papers clutched to her chest, and felt something she had not felt in years, a crack in the wall of her solitude, thin as a hair but wide enough for light to enter. She did not sleep that night. She sat on her bed with the portfolio open before her, reading her father's letters one by one, his voice reaching her across the divide of death, and she wept, not with despair but with the agonizing, unbearable relief of being found. Lady Morvain struck at dawn. She had not slept either. She had heard the creak of footsteps in the east corridor. She had seen the faint glow of candlelight beneath the conservatory door. And she had drawn her conclusions with the speed of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading the subtexts of a house she considered her own. She requested an audience with the Duke before breakfast. Soren received her in the library, standing by the window with his back to the room. He did not turn when she entered. "Your Grace," she began, her voice taut with controlled urgency, "I must bring a grave matter to your attention. Your wife was seen last night entering the conservatory without permission, after midnight. She was in the sealed cabinet, your late father's private room. She has been conducting a secret search of this house, and I have reason to believe she has removed valuable documents from the estate's archives." She paused, allowing the gravity of the accusation to settle. "I have suspected her intentions for some time," she continued, her confidence gathering. "She is not what she appears. Her behavior has been irregular from the start, the wandering, the questions, the way she has insinuated herself into the child's affections. It is all part of a calculated scheme. She married you under false pretenses, and she has been using her position to what?" Soren's voice was quiet. He still had not turned. Morvain hesitated, sensing something in his tone that she could not quite identify.
"To steal from this family, Your Grace."
"I see." He turned from the window. His face was composed, but there was a stillness to it that should have warned her, the stillness of deep water before it closes over something. "And you witnessed this yourself. I heard her leave her room. I followed her to the conservatory and observed the light beneath the cabinet door. You followed her," he repeated. "It is my duty to protect this household. Your duty." He walked slowly to his desk and sat down. He opened a drawer and withdrew a sheaf of papers. Papers Morvain had never seen before, papers he had spent the small hours of the morning examining. "Tell me, Aunt, do you know the name Harland Renwick?" The change in her was instantaneous. The color did not drain from her face. It was extinguished, as if someone had blown out a candle behind her skin. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands clasped before her went rigid. "He was a scholar," she said carefully. "A friend of your father's. He did some work here years ago. He also had a daughter who was cheated of her inheritance by a man named Aldous Renwick, her father's brother." Soren's voice was measured, deliberate, each word placed with the precision of a mason's setting stone. Aldous produced a forged will, stole her property, claimed her father's life work, and cast her out with nothing. Morvain said nothing. Her silence was louder than any confession. You receive letters from Aldous Renwick, Soren continued, on the first Tuesday of every month. You read them in private. You burn them in your grate. He held up one of the papers from his drawer, a half-charred fragment salvaged from the ashes by a maid who had been quietly instructed to preserve anything she found. This one did not burn completely. The fragment contained 4 lines in Aldous Renwick's unmistakable hand, enough to confirm a correspondence, enough to confirm complicity. That is a private matter, Morvain stammered, her composure disintegrating. It has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with it, Soren said, and for the first time his voice rose, not to a shout, but to the hard, carrying tone of a man pronouncing judgment. You knew who she was. You knew who her father was. You knew what Aldous had done, and you stood in this house and watched his daughter eat alone and walk these halls in degradation, while the very people who should have been protecting her looked the other way. You did not just fail her, Morvain. You actively conspired to keep her from finding the truth. Morvain's mouth opened and closed. She looked like a woman watching the ground beneath her feet give way. You came to me this morning to accuse her of theft, Soren said, each word dropping like a stone into a well. The woman you accused of stealing was searching for documents that were already hers. Documents that my father swore to protect. Documents that you have spent months trying to ensure she would never find. He stood. The full height of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the granite set of his face, all of it bore down on the woman who had controlled his household for 20 years. You used my name to restrict her movements. You used my grief as a weapon. You isolated a woman under my protection, and you lied to my face about having my authority to do so. And when your campaign of cruelty failed to drive her away, you came here this morning to finish the job with a fabricated accusation. His voice dropped to a whisper that was more devastating than any shout. I asked you once if you had my approval for the restrictions on the Duchess. You told Hargrove that you did. That was a lie. This morning you told me you observed her yourself. I do not believe that either. You heard her, perhaps. You suspected, but you did not see, because I was already there. Morvain's last defense crumbled. You were in the conservatory? I was in the cabinet, he said. I followed her. I watched her find her father's papers. I read Harland Renwick's letter with my own eyes, and I stood in that room and listened to her explain, with more dignity and composure than you have shown in 20 years of service, why she accepted a marriage to a man who called her a duty. He let the silence descend. It filled the room like water. You will not speak to the Duchess again, he said. You will not speak of her to the staff. You will remain in your rooms until I have decided what is to be done with you. Is that understood? Morvain's voice was a thread. Yes, Your Grace. Go. She went. The door closed behind her with the quiet finality of a chapter ending. Soren sank into his chair and pressed his hands over his face. The rage had burned through him and left behind something raw, shame, bone deep and unforgiving. He had been her jailer, not by intention, but by absence, by indifference, by the criminal laziness of a man who had allowed someone else to govern his home while he hid from his own heart. It was not enough to confront Morvain. It was not enough to find the papers. The damage went deeper than documents and deeds. It went to the core of who he was and who he had failed to be. He needed the full truth, all of it, and he needed it from someone who owed him nothing. Soren did not go to Elowin. Not yet. He understood, with the painful clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding self-knowledge only to have it forced upon him in a single night, that he had not yet earned the right. She had lived in his house for all this time, endured his indifference, survived his aunt's persecution, and found her father's legacy without a single word of help from him. To go to her now, before he understood the full scope of what had been done, would be the act of a man seeking absolution, not justice. He owed her more than that. He began with his father's papers. The old Duke's study, which Soren had avoided since his death, was a chamber of organized chaos. Files, correspondence, account books, and personal journals stacked in the meticulous disorder of a man who knew where everything was and trusted no one else to maintain the system. Soren spent 2 days in that room. He read until his eyes ached and his back seized, and the servants brought meals he forgot to eat. He found the first thread almost immediately. A series of letters between his father and Harland Renwick, spanning nearly 15 years. They revealed a friendship of genuine depth. Two men of different worlds bonded by a shared love of the natural sciences. Harland's letters were warm, erudite, and increasingly concerned. The later one spoke openly of his brother Aldous, of suspicious inquiries, of a growing fear that his life's work was not safe. The final letter was dated 6 weeks before Harland's death. In it, Harland described his decision to place his most important documents in the cabinet at Thornhollow. He listed them precisely: the deed to Rosewood, his original will, 12 of his finest botanical illustrations, and a personal letter to his daughter explaining where everything was hidden. He had given the cabinet key to the old Duke and asked him to hold it in trust. Soren searched his father's desk until he found the key. It was in a small wooden box labeled in his father's hand, "For the Renwick girl. See that she receives it." The old Duke had died before he could fulfill the promise. The key had sat in its box, forgotten, while Harland's daughter had been robbed and cast out, and forced to pick locks in the dark to find what should have been given to her freely. Soren held the key in his palm and felt the weight of a failure that was not his alone, but was now his. To answer for the second thread required outside help, he wrote 3 letters that same evening. One to his family solicitor in London, requesting an urgent investigation into the estate of Harland Renwick and the actions of Aldous Renwick. One to a magistrate he knew in Devon, asking for a discreet inquiry into the circumstances of the contested will. And one to the Professor Pemberton, whose name had appeared in Harland's correspondence as a trusted friend and potential witness. While he waited for responses, he turned his attention to Morvain. The burned letters were gone. She had been thorough in their destruction. But the half-charred fragment he had recovered was enough to establish the fact of correspondence. More damning was what he found in the household accounts. Morvain had been drawing a supplementary allowance from the estate for 20 years. A privilege granted by his father and never questioned. But a careful examination of the figures revealed a pattern. Twice a year, a sum was transferred from the estate account to a private account in Morvain's name, and from there a portion was forwarded to an address in Exeter, Aldous Renwick's address. His aunt had not merely known about the theft. She had profited from it. The arrangement was elegant in its corruption. Aldous stole the property, sold the illustrations, and shared a portion of the proceeds with the woman who ensured that the evidence hidden at Thornhollow was never found. Morvain's 20 years of loyal service, her iron grip on the household, her desperate campaign to keep alone and isolated, all of it was the machinery of complicity, the frantic maintenance of a lie that had enriched her at the cost of a young woman's entire life. The responses from London and Devon arrived within the week. The solicitor confirmed that Aldous Renwick's claim to the estate had been built on a will that bore irregularities consistent with forgery. The magistrate reported that the solicitor who had originally handled the case had been disbarred for fraud in a separate matter. And Professor Pemberton, in a long and emotional letter, confirmed everything: Harland's fears, Aldous's character, and the existence of a daughter who had been, in Pemberton's words, "the finest and most devoted child I have ever had the privilege of knowing, and the most undeservedly wronged." Soren read Pemberton's letter in the library, sitting in the chair where his father had once sat, surrounded by the books that Harland Renwick had once catalogued, and felt the full devastating architecture of the injustice settle into his bones. His wife, his quiet, invisible, endlessly patient wife, was not a charity case. She was not a stray his father had taken pity on. She was a woman of intelligence and courage and profound integrity who had been systematically destroyed by a conspiracy that reached into the very walls of his own home. And he had called her a duty. He gathered the papers, the deed, the will, the letters, the financial records, the solicitor's report, and placed them in the leather portfolio that Eloan had found in the cabinet. He added his father's key still in its labeled box. He tied the portfolio shut and set it on his desk. Then he rang for Hargrove. "Bring Lady Morvain to the library," he said. "And then find the Duchess. Ask her to come as well." The butler's face remained professionally blank, but something flickered behind his eyes, a satisfaction he was too well trained to show. "At once, Your Grace." Eloan had spent the past week in a state of suspended animation. She had not seen the Duke since the night in the cabinet. She had not seen Morvain either. The woman had been confined to her rooms, and the household moved around her absence like a river, adjusting to a removed stone. Cressida had remained at Thornhollow, a steady, warm presence who did not press Eloan for explanations, but whose knowing glances communicated a quiet solidarity. The portfolio was locked in Eloan's writing desk. She had read every document a dozen times. She had cried until there were no tears left. And then she had dried her face and waited, because waiting was the only skill this life had given her in abundance. When Hargrove appeared at her door with the summons, she felt no surprise. Only a deep settling calm, the calm of a woman who has carried a weight for so long that its removal, whether by relief or catastrophe, can only be a mercy. She dressed with care, not in the drab dark gown she had worn for months, but in a dress of pale sage that Cressida had given her. "You are a duchess, child, not a governess." And she left her hair simply pinned, and she walked to the library with her head held level and her hands still at her sides. The library at Thornhollow was a vast, somber room with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling and let in the cold northern light. It smelled of leather and wood polish and the faint, ghostly sweetness of dried flowers. It had always felt to Eloan like a room with a memory, a space that held the imprint of every conversation that had ever taken place within its walls. Lady Morvain was already there. She stood near the fireplace, and she had aged a decade in a week. Her rigid posture had collapsed into something hunched and defensive. Her face, always sharp, was now gaunt, the skin pulled tight over the bones beneath. She did not look at Eloan when she entered. She looked at the floor, and her hands clasped before her trembled with a fine, constant vibration. Soren stood behind his desk. The portfolio lay before him, its contents spread across the mahogany surface like evidence in a courtroom. His face was grave, composed, but there was something in his eyes that Eloan had never seen before, a depth, a heat, an intensity that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with conviction. He looked at Eloan as she entered, and for one unguarded moment, his expression softened, a flicker. No more than that, a brief lowering of the drawbridge before it was raised again. But she saw it, and it was enough to steady her. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. His voice was formal, controlled. This was not a conversation. It was a proceeding. Eloan sat. Morvain remained standing. The room waited. 3 years ago, Soren began, his voice carrying the weight of every document he had read and every truth he had uncovered. A man named Harlan Renwick died in Devon, leaving behind a daughter and a lifetime of work that should have secured her future. Within days of his death, his brother Aldous produced a forged will, seized the property, sold the life's work, and left that daughter with nothing. He paused. His gaze moved to Morvain, and it did not waver. The daughter was 21 years old. She had no family, no resources, no recourse. She spent 2 years in destitution, working as a seamstress, a governess, whatever she could find, while the man who stole from her lived comfortably on the proceeds of her father's genius. Morvaine's trembling intensified. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. Harland Renwick was not a fool, Soren continued. He knew his brother's intentions. Before his death, he placed his most important documents, his original will, the deed to his property, and his private correspondence in the care of my father here at Thornhollow, in the cabinet off the conservatory where he had worked. My father accepted the trust. My father swore to protect it. He picked up the small wooden box from the desk and opened it, revealing the key inside. My father died before he could fulfill that promise. The documents remained hidden. The key remained in his desk, labeled in his own hand for the Renwick girl. See that she receives it. I found it there 3 days ago. I should have found it 2 years ago. I should have looked. He set the box down. The silence in the room was absolute. The daughter, left without recourse, did the only thing she could. She found her way into this house, the one place she believed the proof of her father's wishes still existed. She accepted a marriage she did not want, to a man she did not know, and she endured 8 months of isolation, hostility, and humiliation in order to search for the truth that would restore her name. He turned to Elowen. His eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she had never dared to hope for. Not pity, not obligation, but recognition. The same recognition she had seen in Rosalind's gray eyes on the day the child took her hand. The recognition of one soul seeing another clearly, fully, without pretense. Her name, he said, and his voice caught for the first time a fracture in the granite, small but unmistakable, is not Elowen Blackwood. He paused. The room held its breath. Her name is Elowen Margaret Renwick. She is the daughter of Harland Renwick, and she is the rightful owner of Rosewood Cottage and everything her father left to her. The words filled the library like light filling a dark room. Elowen heard them, and felt something inside her break, not shatter, but break open, the way ice breaks on a river in spring, violent and necessary and long overdue. She did not cry. Not yet. She sat perfectly still, her hands in her lap, her chin lifted, and she let the sound of her own name settle into the air of the room that had been her prison and her salvation. Soren turned to Morvaine. You knew, he said. You knew who she was. You knew what Aldous had done. You knew because you helped him do it. Morvaine made a sound, a thin, strangled protest that died in her throat. The financial records are quite clear, Soren continued, his voice dropping to the low, cutting tone that was worse than any shout. Wine. Twice a year, for the past 3 years, funds from this estate's accounts were transferred to Aldous Renwick through your personal account. You were paid for your silence. You were paid to ensure that the documents in the cabinet were never found. And when a young woman arrived in this house who might have found them, you did everything in your power to break her. He picked up the charred fragment of Aldous's letter. You burned the evidence. You restricted her movements. You isolated her from the one person in this house who showed her kindness, a 5-year-old child who had not spoken in 2 years. You weaponized my grief and my indifference to serve your own ends. And when all of that failed, you came to me with a fabricated accusation of theft, hoping I would throw her out before she could find what was rightfully hers. Morvaine's legs gave way. She sank into the chair behind her, her hands gripping the armrests, her face a mask of devastation. I did not. I never meant for. Her voice was barely a whisper, each word a stone dragged from a collapsing wall. You never meant for her to suffer? Soren's voice was quiet, terrible. Or you never meant to be caught? Morvaine had no answer. The question needed none. Soren picked up the portfolio, the deed, the will, the letters, the illustrations, all of it gathered and bound in the leather case that Harland Renwick had assembled with his own hands for his daughter's future. He came around the desk and stopped before Elowen. He held the portfolio out to her, not dropping it on the desk, not sliding it across the surface. He held it in both hands and offered it to her, the way one offers something sacred. This belongs to you, he said. It always did. and I am more sorry than I know how to say that it was not given to you the day you walked through my door." Eloan took the portfolio. "You're right." She held it against her chest the way she had held it in the candlelit cabinet, but this time there was no fear, no secrecy, no desperate midnight fumbling. She held it in the light of day, in front of the woman who had tried to destroy her, and she held it as what it was, the proof of her father's love, returned to her at last. The tears came, then silent, steady, unstoppable. They ran down her face, and she did not wipe them away. She let them fall because they had been earned, every one of them, over 3 years of loss and silence and endurance. Soren looked at Morvain. The older woman sat broken in her chair, stripped of every defense, every pretension of authority. "A carriage will take you to the station tomorrow morning," he said. "You will not return to Thornhollow. The funds in your account will be frozen pending a full investigation. Aldous Renwick will be dealt with through the courts. Whatever arrangement you had with him is finished." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet finality of his words was more devastating than fury. It was the sound of a door closing forever. Morvain rose on unsteady legs. She looked at Eloan, one long, hollowed look that held everything she would never say. Then she turned and walked from the room, and the sound of her footsteps fading down the corridor was the sound of 20 years of tyranny ending in silence. The library was still. The afternoon light fell across the desk in long, golden bars. Eloan sat with a portfolio in her arms, tears still falling, and felt the weight of 3 years lift from her shoulders with a slowness that was itself a kind of pain, the pain of a body remembering what it felt like to stand without a burden. Soren had not moved. He stood before her, and his face, that severe, guarded granite face, was open in a way she had never seen. The mask was gone. Beneath it was not weakness, but a raw, unfinished tenderness that he clearly did not know how to wear. "I called you a duty," he said, his voice rough. "I stood in my study and reduced you to a word, and that word followed you through every room of this house. I cannot take it back. I cannot undo the months you spent in silence because of my cowardice. But I can tell you this." He knelt. The Duke of Ashenmere knelt on the library floor before the woman he had married without seeing, and he took her hand, the hand that was calloused from needlework and chapped from cold water and steady as bedrock, and he held it. "You are not my duty," he said. "You are my conscience. You are the bravest person I have ever known. And if you will allow it, I would like to spend the rest of my life earning the right to say your name." Eloan looked at him through her tears. She looked at his hand around hers, at his dark eyes stripped of every defense, at the man who had been a ghost and was now finally present. "Then say it," she whispered. He lifted her hand. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so gentle, so deliberate, so unlike the brisk efficiency of everything he had ever done, that it undid her completely. "Eloan," he said, "just that, her name." Spoken not as a title or a formality, but as a prayer, the first honest word he had said in years. 6 months had passed, and Thornhollow was unrecognizable, not in its structure. The gray stone walls still stood against the Northumberland sky, the moors still stretched to the horizon, the wind still carried the scent of heather and peat through the open windows. But something had changed in the house's character, in the quality of its silence. It was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of peace, the kind that settles over a place when the people within it have finally stopped hiding from each other. The conservatory had been Eloan's first project. She had reopened it fully in April, clearing the overgrown ivy, repairing the cracked glass panes, and beginning the slow, painstaking work of restoring the collection her father had once catalogued. She worked with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, soil under her fingernails, her father's illustrations pinned to a board above her work table. She was not recreating his work. She was continuing it, expanding the catalog, adding new specimens, annotating his notes with her own observations in the same careful hand. The cabinet was her study now. Soren had given her the key, the original one, from the labeled box, and she wore it on a chain around her neck. It was the room where Harlan Renwick's legacy lived on and where his daughter was most herself. The legal proceedings against Aldous had been swift. Rosewood Cottage was restored to Eloin's name. The stolen illustrations were being recovered. Aldous faced criminal charges. Morvain was gone, sent to a small cottage on a distant holding. It was more mercy than the woman deserved. A new housekeeper named Mrs. Aldrin ran the house with warmth rather than rigidity, and the staff had thawed. Eloin was no longer the ghost at the breakfast table, but the woman who walked the grounds with the Duke and discussed botany with Lady Cressida in the evenings. But the greatest transformation was the smallest one. It happened on a morning in May, in the conservatory, with the sun streaming through the repaired glass and the scent of jasmine thick in the warm air. Eloin was at her work table pressing a specimen of wild thyme between sheets of blotting paper. She heard the door open and the soft pad of small feet on the stone floor. She did not look up. She had learned that Rosalind came to her like a bird comes to a feeder, approaching freely only when it did not feel observed. The child climbed onto the stool beside the work table. She watched Eloin work for several minutes, her gray eyes following the careful movements of fingers and paper and plant. Then she reached out and touched the sprig of thyme with one small finger. Eloin held her breath. Rosalind leaned forward. She brought her face close to the thyme and inhaled, her eyes closing. When she opened them again, she looked up at Eloin with an expression that was no longer guarded, no longer searching. It was open, luminous, full. And she spoke. "It smells like the garden," she said. 5 words. 5 small, perfect, ordinary words, spoken in a voice rusty from 2 years of disuse, in a tone so quiet, it was barely louder than the hum of bees outside the glass. Eloin's hands stilled. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She looked at the child beside her, this brave, battered, miraculous child who had chosen to break her silence, not with a grand declaration, but with a simple observation about the smell of thyme. And she smiled. "It does," she said. "Would you like to plant some?" Rosalind nodded, and then she smiled back. A small, tentative, world-altering smile that cracked open the last sealed chamber of the grieving house and let the light pour in. When Soren found them an hour later, they were kneeling side by side in the garden bed outside the conservatory, their hands covered in soil, a row of thyme seedlings planted in a crooked, imperfect line. Rosalind looked up at her father. "We planted thyme," she said. Soren stood perfectly still. His face did not move. But Eloin, who had learned to read him the way she read old texts, slowly, carefully, attending to what lay beneath the surface, saw what passed across his features. Not shock, not disbelief, something far larger and far quieter. The gratitude of a man who had been given back something he had believed was gone forever. He knelt in the dirt beside his daughter. He did not care about his coat. He did not care about the soil on his knees. He put his arm around the child and held her, and over the top of her dark head his eyes found Eloin's. He did not speak. He did not need to. His gaze said everything: the apology, the gratitude, the love that had been growing in the silence between them like a seed in dark earth, unseen but relentless. Eloin held his gaze and felt the last of her armor fall away. Not with a crash, but with a sigh, the way a held breath is finally released. Later that evening, after Rosalind had been put to bed, chattering now tentatively about the garden and the thyme and whether caterpillars had feelings, Soren found Eloin in the library. She was sitting in the chair by the window, the same chair where she had sat on her first miserable morning in this house, staring at a garden she could not enter. But the view was different now. The garden was in bloom. The evening light was golden. And the woman in the chair was not the same woman who had buttered her toast in silence and walked the corridors like a ghost. "She spoke," he said, standing in the doorway. She did. He came into the room and sat in the chair beside hers. They were close enough to touch, but they did not touch. Not yet. The space between them was no longer a gulf. It was a threshold. You gave her back her voice, he said. She found it herself. I only gave her a reason to use it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the low, careful tone of a man who has rehearsed something 100 times and is still afraid of getting it wrong, you have given this house back its life. Eloanne, you have given my daughter back her words. You have given me back. He stopped. He looked at his hands, then at her. Everything, he finished. You have given me back everything I thought I had lost. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact. His fingers closed around hers immediately, tightly as if he had been waiting for it for months. You did not marry me out of duty, she said softly. You married me out of a promise your father made to mine, and promises are never just duty. They are the shape of who we are. He held her hand against his chest, over his heart. Then let me make a new promise, not my father's, mine. He looked at her, and what remained was the man, imperfect, awakened, wholly present. I promise to see you, every day, for the rest of my life. Not as a duty, not as an obligation. As the woman who walked into a cold house and made it warm. As the woman who held my daughter's hand when I could not. As the woman who taught me that love is not a weakness to be managed. It is the only thing worth being brave for. Eloanne leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. They stayed like that, breathing the same air, their hands intertwined, while the last light of the day turned the library windows to gold. Somewhere in the house, a child was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 2 years. Somewhere in the conservatory, a row of thyme seedlings was taking root in dark earth. And in the library of Thorn Hollow Hall, in the room where a father's promise had been hidden and a daughter's name had been restored, 2 people who had been strangers in their own marriage sat together in the quiet and let the silence between them become, at last, a conversation.